Making bread at home doesn't need to feel complicated or time-consuming. With a bread machine, you can produce a warm, soft loaf with only a handful of ingredients and minimal effort. This recipe focuses on creating the simplest bread machine bread possible using basic pantry staples. It's the kind of bread that works for sandwiches, toast, or as a side with dinner. If you're new to bread machines, this guide will walk you through the process with straightforward instructions and practical tips to get the best texture and flavor every time. Required equipment. You don't need a lot to get started. A standard bread machine is the main tool, and everything else is probably already in your kitchen. Bread machine with a standard loaf pan. Measuring cups and spoons. Digital kitchen scale, optional but recommended for accuracy. Rubber spatula for scraping down sides if needed. A digital scale helps make bread recipes more consistent, but you can get by with measuring cups if you don't have one yet. Prep times and yield. Prep time, 5 minutes, just adding ingredients to the machine. Cook time, 3 to 3.5 hours, depending on your machine's basic bread cycle. Total time, about 3.5 hours. Servings, 1 loaf, about 12 slices. The hands-on time is minimal. Most of the work happens inside the bread machine while you go about your day. Ingredients. The ingredient list is short and simple. Each one plays a key role in the final loaf's texture and flavor. Ingredient, US measurement, metric measurement. Warm water, 1 cup, 240 milliliters. Bread flour, 3 cups, 360 grams. Salt, 2 tablespoons, 25 grams, 8 grams. Unsalted butter, 2 tablespoons, 28 grams. Active dry yeast, 240 teaspoons. Warm water helps activate the yeast, while bread flour gives the loaf structure and chew. Butter adds a bit of richness, and sugar helps the yeast work while adding a hint of sweetness. Preparation instructions. Add ingredients in the right order. For most bread machines, liquids go in first, followed by dry ingredients, and yeast last. This keeps the yeast separate from the water until mixing begins. Pour the warm water into the bread pan. Then add the bread flour, sugar, and salt. Place the butter on top of the flour. Finally, make a small well in the flour and pour in the yeast. Select the basic bread setting. Every bread machine has slightly different names for settings, but you're looking for the basic or white bread cycle. Set the crust color to medium if your machine allows. Let the machine do the mixing and kneading. Once the machine starts, peek in during the first 5 to 10 minutes. If the dough looks too dry or shaggy, add a teaspoon of water at a time. If it's sticking to the sides, sprinkle in a teaspoon of flour. The dough should form a smooth, slightly tacky ball. Allow the machine to complete the rise and bake cycles. After the kneading phase, the bread machine will handle the rise and baking on its own. Avoid opening the lid during the baking cycle. It can cause the loaf to sink. Cool the bread properly. When the cycle ends, carefully remove the loaf from the pan and place it on a wire rack. Let it cool at least 30 minutes before slicing to prevent the inside from becoming gummy. Tips for the best texture. Bread machines are forgiving, but a few small adjustments can make your loaf better. Using bread flour instead of all-purpose helps create the structure needed for a soft but sturdy bread. Measuring ingredients by weight rather than volume helps keep the dough consistent. If your kitchen is cold, use water on the warmer side, around 110 degrees Fahrenheit or 43 degrees Celsius, to help the yeast activate. Don't skip the cooling step. It's tempting to cut into fresh bread right away, but the interior continues to set as it cools. Cutting too soon can make the loaf compress and lose its airy texture. Understanding the ingredients. The beauty of this recipe is in its simplicity. Each ingredient serves a clear purpose. Bread flour contains more protein than all-purpose, which helps create gluten, the network that gives bread its chew and rise. Sugar feeds the yeast, making the dough rise more evenly. Salt doesn't just add flavor. It helps control yeast activity so the bread doesn't rise too fast and collapse. Butter adds moisture and a subtle richness, making the loaf soft without being greasy. And yeast, of course, is the engine that turns the mixture into a risen loaf instead of a dense brick. Adjusting the recipe. Once you've made this loaf a few times, you might want to tweak it to fit your taste. You can replace half the bread flour with whole wheat for a heartier loaf, though you might need to add a little extra water to compensate for the bran. Swapping out the butter for olive oil changes the flavor slightly and gives the bread a lighter texture. If you like a sweeter bread, a tablespoon of honey can replace the sugar. For a softer crust, brush the top of the loaf with melted butter right after it comes out of the machine. For a firmer crust, leave it to cool completely without covering it. Serving suggestions. This bread's neutral flavor makes it versatile. It works well for sandwiches because it's soft enough to bite through, but sturdy enough to hold fillings. Toast brings out a slightly nutty flavor, especially if you use butter before browning. It's also great as a side with soups or stews, where the slightly chewy texture can hold up to dipping. Storage. Homemade bread doesn't have preservatives, so it won't last as long as store-bought. Store the loaf in a bread bag or wrapped in a clean kitchen towel at room temperature for 2 to 3 days. For longer storage, slice the loaf and freeze the slices in a freezer bag. Pull out what you need and toast straight from the freezer. Troubleshooting common issues. Even simple bread recipes can go wrong sometimes, especially when you're learning your machine. If the bread comes out too dense, it's often because the dough was too dry or the yeast didn't activate well. Check that your yeast isn't expired and that your water was warm enough but not hot. If the loaf collapses in the middle, it may have risen too much. Reducing the yeast slightly or using cooler water can help. Why use a bread machine? Bread machines take out most of the guesswork. They handle mixing, kneading, rising, and baking in one container, which is perfect if you don't want to spend hours shaping dough or watching rise times. For people with busy schedules, they make homemade bread accessible without sacrificing flavor or texture. Final thoughts. Making bread doesn't need to feel intimidating. This simplest bread machine bread proves that with just a few ingredients and the press of a button, you can create a loaf that tastes fresher and better than most store-bought options. It's forgiving enough for beginners, but still satisfying for experienced home cooks who want a reliable, everyday bread recipe. FAQs. Can I use all-purpose flour instead of bread flour? Yes, though the texture will be a bit softer and less chewy. You may also need slightly less water since all-purpose flour absorbs differently. What's the difference between active dry yeast and instant yeast for this recipe? You can use instant yeast without changing the measurements. It will rise a bit faster, but in a bread machine, the difference isn't significant. Can I add herbs or cheese to this bread? Yes, once you're comfortable with the basic recipe. Add dried herbs or shredded cheese during the kneading stage after the first few minutes of mixing. Why did my bread come out dense? Usually it's because of too little water or inactive yeast. Make sure your yeast is fresh and your dough forms a smooth ball during kneading. Can I double this recipe for a larger loaf? Only if your bread machine supports larger loaves. Check the manual before doubling. Otherwise, the dough may overflow and bake unevenly.